What forms the real picture of the poor demands a song. That's George Crabbe speaking in his poem "The Village." Crabbe known for his social realism. We'll talk more about that in a minute. A little background on George Crabbe. He was born and raised in a town of Aldborough, which is a poor fishing village in Suffolk on the east coast of England, and this place broke his heart. He returned several times in his life, and I don't think he liked it very much there. In 1768, he begins a medical apprenticeship that continues until 1775, quite a long time. And during this period, he would meet a woman named Sarah Elmy, who would later become his wife, and he's publishing his first poems during this early period. In 1777, he attempts to start a practice as a physician in London, but is forced back to Aldborough, where he fares no better. In 1780, he's back in London again and decides to pursue a literary career, and meets a man named Edmund Burke, who was an important literary patron and a member of Samuel Johnson's influential literary club. Edmund Burke also helped the career of Oliver Goldsmith. So he shows Edmund Burke some of his poetry, including an early draft of The Village. Edmund Burke is impressed and introduces him to Samuel Johnson and the painter Sir Joshua Reynolds. This is the early 1780s. So with Burke's support and influence, he becomes an Anglican minister back in Aldborough, but eventually accepts an appointment as chaplain to the Duke of Rutland at Belvoir Castle. And this provides him with the financial security that he needs to marry Sarah and to continue writing poetry. So 1780 and 81 is really an important year for him in establishing himself. In 1783, he publishes The Village, which is the poem that we're looking at. In 96, the death of his son Edmund at the age of 6 years old would have a profound effect on him and on his family. His wife Sarah begins a mental decline that forces him to devote much of his time to her care until her death in 1813, and he does not do much writing during the later 1780s, 1790s. In 1807, he publishes his first book in over 20 years, which contains some old and newer poems, including one called The Parish Register. And this was a collection of narrative poems with a strong social realist bent. This is what Crabbe was known for at the time. That was the novelty of his work. And we'll talk more about that when we get to talk about The Village. In 1809, he begins a friendship. At first, it's just by letter with the poet and novelist Sir Walter Scott, a major figure in early 19th century literature, historical novelist. From 1810 to 1819, he publishes several popular collections of narrative poems. The first being The Burrow in 1810, and then Tales in 1812, and Tales from the Hall in 1819. And then in 1832, he passes away. And it's the same year that Walter Scott died, actually, after a brief illness. But we're focused mainly on The Village. This is the only noteworthy poem that Crabbe would publish in the 18th century. His reputation does rest more on the work that he published later in life, his verse tales, The Parish Register, Tales, and Tales from the Hall. And while we can read The Village as a direct response to Oliver Goldsmith's poem, The Deserted Village, which had come out in 1770. While he agreed in principle with Goldsmith's indignation at the luxuriousness and corruption that allowed the wealthy to exploit the rural poor. He also felt that Goldsmith had grossly misrepresented his subject matter and that he had relied too much on the conventions of pastoral poetry inherited from Virgil and Augustan poets like Pope and Matthew Prior. And even though he writes in heroic couplets, the Augustan verse form, he professes to paint a more realistic picture of rustic life, a picture that is true to the physical hardships and the moral failings of those who live in abject poverty or financial precarity at the very least. So some things to look for in the village for us to talk about in class. What is Crabbe's view of pastoral poetry? He devotes a considerable number of lines early on in the village to this topic. How is his vision of nature and rural life different from Goldsmith's? How does he portray the poor and those entrusted with their care? There's a physician and a curate in the village, and unlike Goldsmith's curate and schoolmaster in The Deserted Village, Crabbe's portrayal of these individuals is not very flattering. How does this differ as well from John Dyer's treatment of the poor in The Fleece? And compared to Goldsmith, what is different about Crabbe's portrayal of women and family life? And what is Crabbe's purpose in writing The Village? Does poetry have the same power of influence for him as it does for Goldsmith? So these are the things I want you to think about as you read The Village and prepare for class. And I look forward to our discussion. That concludes this short introduction to George Crabbe.